The cold did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, day by day, stealing small things first. By late autumn, breath no longer vanished. It lingered in the air like pale smoke. Axe handles rang sharper against frozen wood. The river slowed, thickened, then began to fall silent beneath a skin of ice. In the high valleys of the northern Rockies, men learned quickly that winter here was not a season. It was a test. When the temperature dropped past 40 below, the cold stopped behaving like weather. It became pressure. It pressed through wool, through leather, through skin. It found gaps in walls no wider than a finger and turned them into knives of moving air. It punished mistakes without drama and without mercy. In those years, a cabin was not a home. It was a life support system. Men built fast because speed mattered. They followed what everyone else followed: single log walls, tight corner notches, moss and clay forced into the cracks, a small iron stove at the center, a roof steep enough to shed snow. The formula was simple, proven, and repeated across valleys and creeks. And it worked, right up until it didn't. When the deep cold settled in and refused to leave, cabins that looked solid in October began to fail by inches. Heat bled out faster than men could replace it. Fires burned hot at dusk and died too quickly before dawn. Water froze within arm's reach of the stove. Sleep fractured into short, exhausted intervals measured by how often a man woke to feed the fire. This was the cold that killed quietly, not in storms, not in avalanches, but at 3 in the morning, when the fire was out and the walls had nothing left to give. Most men believed survival meant burning more wood, more flame, more heat, more effort, but one man did not. His name was Elias Rook. While others rushed to finish their cabins and bank their foundations with earth, Elias was still hauling stone, rounded river rock, smooth from centuries of water and ice. He moved slowly, methodically, as if time itself were not pressing down on the valley. Neighbors watched him with disbelief. They had already stacked their firewood, sealed their walls, and retreated indoors. Elias, meanwhile, stood ankle-deep in frozen leaves, measuring distances with a length of twine, setting 2 parallel lines of foundation logs where one would have sufficed. 2 walls. Not thicker logs, 2 separate walls. Men shook their heads as they passed. Some laughed. Some muttered that he would never finish before the cold closed its grip. To them, Elias Rook looked like a man wasting precious strength on unnecessary work. In a land where survival depended on speed, he was choosing patience. In a season where fire meant life, he was hauling stone that could not burn. No one yet understood that Elias was not building for warmth at dusk. He was building for dawn, because the real enemy was not how cold it got during the day. It was how fast a cabin gave up its heat when the fire went out. The cold of these mountains punished ignorance of time. It punished thin walls and short thinking. It punished any structure that relied entirely on constant effort instead of stored strength. Elias Rook had seen winters where fire failed, and he had learned long before this valley that survival did not belong to the man who burned the most wood, but to the man who understood what heat did after the flames were gone. That lesson would soon divide this settlement into 2 kinds of men: those who spent the winter waking every 2 hours, feeding fires and losing sleep, and one man who slept through the night, while the temperature outside fell far below anything a flame alone could defeat. And when the cold finally arrived in full, the kind that freezes breath before it leaves your mouth, everyone would learn the same truth, whether they were ready or not. In this country, winter does not care how hard you work. It only respects what you understand. By the time the first hard frosts locked the ground, nearly every man in the valley was building the same cabin. The dimensions barely varied: 12 by 14 feet, sometimes a little larger, rarely smaller. Walls made from a single layer of spruce logs, notched tight at the corners, moss clay, and frozen earth pressed into every crack until the seams looked solid enough to stop a knife blade. A steep roof to shed snow. A small iron stove set close to the center of the room. It was the standard frontier formula. Simple, familiar, fast. Men trusted it because it had worked before, on rivers farther south, in logging camps, in valleys where winter bit hard but eventually loosened its grip. The logic was straightforward. Keep the wind out, keep the fire hot, and the cabin would take care of the rest. And in mild cold, it did. In the evenings, these cabins felt almost comfortable. Stoves glowed red. Boots steamed dry near the hearth. Coffee stayed liquid. The walls, warmed by radiant heat, seemed solid and dependable. Men leaned back on their bunks, convinced they had beaten winter through good craftsmanship and hard work. But this comfort was temporary. What most builders did not understand, because no one had ever taught them, was how little heat a thin log wall could actually hold. Wood warmed quickly, but it gave up that warmth just as fast. Once the fire slowed, the walls began bleeding heat into the night like a cut that would not clot. By midnight, the change became noticeable. The floor stiffened with cold. Frost began to creep back across the inside corners. By 3 a.m, the stove sat dark and quiet, and the cabin had already surrendered most of the warmth it had borrowed at dusk. Men woke shivering, hands numb, breath hanging heavy above their blankets. They pulled on boots and gloves without fully opening their eyes, feeding the stove by memory alone. Then they waited, for flame, for heat, for the walls to forgive them. This was the unspoken routine of winter life. Wake, stoke, wait, sleep, repeat. No one questioned it, because everyone endured it together. If a cabin failed, the explanation was always the same. Not enough wood, not a hot enough fire, not enough effort. The solution was never to build differently, only to burn more. More hours cutting timber, more cords stacked against the wall, more nights interrupted, more exhaustion carried into the day's labor. Survival became a balance between how much energy a man could burn in his stove and how much strength he had left to keep going. The cabins themselves never changed. Single walls, thin mass, fast heat loss. They were shelters built to resist the cold, not to manage it. And so the valley filled with men doing everything right by the standards they knew, working harder, feeding fires longer, trusting that effort alone could overcome the physics pressing against their walls. Everyone, that is, except Elias Rook. While his neighbors focused on stopping drafts and stacking firewood, Elias was thinking about what happened after the fire went out. While others judged a cabin by how warm it felt at supper, he measured comfort by how much warmth remained at dawn. To most men, his thinking seemed unnecessary. To winter, it would soon prove essential. Because in a land where darkness lasted 16 hours and the cold did not retreat, the difference between surviving and suffering was not how hot a cabin could get, but how slowly it could let that heat go. And the standard cabin, no matter how well built, had no answer for that question at all. Elias Rook did not look like a man preparing to outlast a northern winter. He was not young, and he was not in a hurry. His movements were steady rather than strong, deliberate rather than fast. While others swung axes with the urgency of men racing a clock, Elias worked as if the clock did not exist. That alone set him apart. Most settlers measured progress by visible milestones, walls raised, roofs closed, smoke rising from a finished chimney. Elias seemed uninterested in appearances. Day after day, he hauled stone from the riverbank instead of stacking firewood. He stopped often to measure, to adjust, to think. From a distance, it looked like indecision. Up close, it was calculation. Men passing by slowed to watch him work. They noticed the unusual layout first. 2 parallel lines of foundation logs where one should have been. A narrow, deliberate gap between them. Stakes driven with care. Twine pulled tight and checked twice. Someone eventually asked the question everyone was thinking. Building 2 cabins? Elias did not look up right away. He finished setting a log, checked it for level, then straightened slowly. 1, he said. Nothing more. That answer earned laughter. In a place where shelter meant survival, anything that slowed completion was suspect. Every extra log was a risk. Every extra day outside was a gamble. Elias was taking both, and doing it without explanation. To the others, his plan made no sense. They had seen winter before. They knew what worked. Tight walls, hot stove, plenty of wood. Elias was ignoring all of it, choosing instead to double his labor for reasons no one understood. Some called it caution. Most called it foolishness. What they did not know was that Elias had learned to fear the wrong kind of warmth. Years earlier, in another place just as cold, he had watched men survive evenings only to fail before morning. He had seen cabins that felt comfortable at dusk turn deadly by dawn. He had learned that heat which arrives quickly also leaves quickly, and that the most dangerous cold comes after the fire has done its work and gone silent. Elias did not build to impress his neighbors. He built to defeat time. He measured walls not in inches, but in hours. He thought in terms of night length, not daylight comfort. Where others saw a structure, he saw a system, one that would either store warmth or surrender it. The stones he hauled were not decoration. They were not insulation. They were weight, mass, and patience made physical. Each rounded rock carried heat slowly, reluctantly, and gave it back just as slowly. Elias knew this not from books, but from memory, of old structures that stayed warm long after fires died, of cold resisted not by flame, but by mass. Still, to the men watching him, none of this mattered. All they saw was a man burning daylight while winter advanced. A man building something heavier, slower, and stranger than necessary. A man choosing stone where others chose speed. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the valley floor, Elias was often the last one still working. The sound of his labor, stones settling against wood, logs being notched with care, carried through the quiet while finished cabins nearby glowed warm with firelight. From those doorways, men shook their heads. They believed Elias Rook was building the wrong cabin for the right winter. Soon, winter would decide who was right. From the moment Elias Rook began raising his walls, it was clear that his cabin would not resemble anything else in the valley. Most cabins rose quickly, logs stacked tight, corners locked, gaps filled as soon as the walls reached shoulder height. Elias did the opposite. He raised two walls at the same time, inner and outer, never allowing one to outpace the other. Between them, he maintained a narrow, deliberate space, measured carefully with spacer blocks he had cut by hand. 12 inches. No more. No less. The structure puzzled everyone who saw it. From the outside, it looked unfinished. From the inside, it looked excessive. 2 complete log shells where one had always been enough. Men stopped on the trail to stare. Too much wood, someone muttered. 2 cabins for 1 roof, said another. Elias said nothing. He worked methodically, notching cross ties every few feet to bind the inner and outer walls together. These horizontal braces turned the space between the walls into a rigid frame, strong enough to carry weight without bowing or shifting. Only when the walls reached chest height did the true oddity reveal itself. Elias began filling the gap. He did not use sawdust or earth. He did not pack moss. He hauled stone, rounded river rock, heavy and cold to the touch, and lowered each piece carefully into the cavity between the walls. Larger stones went in first, seated firmly. Smaller ones followed, wedged tight to eliminate empty space. The sound was unmistakable. Stone settling against wood. Weight finding its place. Men laughed openly now. Stone doesn't make heat, one called out. Can't burn rock, another added. They were right, at least by the rules they knew. To them, warmth came from flame alone. A stove burned wood, the fire heated air, and the walls existed only to slow the escape. Elias was violating every accepted assumption. He was adding mass where others tried to stay light. He was slowing construction where speed meant safety. But Elias was not building an insulated box. He was building a reservoir. Each stone he set was another moment of heat delayed. Another hour the cabin would resist cooling once the fire faded. The walls were no longer barriers alone. They were storage. He placed his stove with equal care, not tight against an outer wall but slightly inward, where radiant heat could reach both the room and the stone-filled core. He lined sections of the wall behind it with brick, giving the rising heat more surface to strike before it escaped up the flue. Nothing about the design was accidental. The cabin grew heavier with each passing day. By the time the stone fill reached full height, the walls were nearly 3 feet thick from outside log to inside log. The structure no longer felt like a typical frontier shelter. It felt grounded, anchored to the land rather than perched upon it. Neighbors shook their heads as they passed finished cabins to watch Elias still at work. Winter was coming fast. Snow already dusted the ground. Mornings cut sharp and dry. Men inside their cabins split kindling by lamplight while Elias lifted stone in the open air. To them, his cabin was overbuilt, inefficient, and late. To Elias Rook, it was finally becoming what he needed. Not a place that felt warm at supper, but a place that would still be warm when the fire had been out for hours and the night had done its worst. Soon, the valley would learn the difference. The first weeks of winter were a deception. The cold came early, but it came gently. Frost coated the ground each morning, then vanished beneath the weak afternoon sun. Men slept comfortably enough, convinced they had prepared well. Smoke rose from chimneys at a lazy angle, drifting across the valley like proof that everything was under control. Then the temperature stopped climbing back. One morning, The frost did not melt. The next, the river stiffened along its edges. And then the air itself changed, dry, motionless, and heavy, as if the valley had been sealed beneath a lid of glass. This was the cold that stayed. By the time the thermometer dropped past 40 below, the valley no longer felt alive. Sound carried farther. Wood cracked without warning. Breath froze before it could drift away. The cold pressed inward, steady and relentless, testing every joint, every seam, every assumption men had made about their shelters. At first, the cabins responded as expected. Stoves burned hotter. Men fed them more often. Evening temperatures stayed comfortable, sometimes even warm. Boots dried. Coffee boiled. Optimism lingered. But night told a different story. By midnight, the fires slowed. By 2 in the morning, the iron stoves glowed dull red instead of bright. By 3, the coals were thin and scattered. And with the fire's retreat, the cabins began to lose heat faster than anyone expected. Water buckets developed a skin of ice just a few feet from the stove. Frost crept back along the lower walls. Men woke shivering, their breath fogging the air inside their own cabins. Sleep fractured. Some rose every 2 hours. Others never truly slept at all. They lay half awake, listening for the stove's breath, gauging by instinct when it was time to feed it again. Each night became a calculation. How much would remain, how long the fire would last, how cold the cabin would be before morning. The single-wall cabins were doing exactly what they had always done. They were warming quickly and cooling just as fast. Thin log walls had no reserve. Once the fire faded, there was nothing left to slow the loss. Heat poured outward into the darkness, escaping through wood, seams, and shrinking chinking. The walls themselves turned cold to the touch, becoming surfaces that drew warmth away from the men inside. In one cabin, ice formed along the floorboards. In another, frost traced delicate patterns across the interior corners. A few men woke to find their wash water frozen solid, even though the stove sat only an arm's length away. These were not failures of effort. They were failures of design. Meanwhile, a different rhythm was settling into Elias Rook's cabin. Each evening, Elias fired his stove hard for a short, deliberate stretch. The flames roared, the iron surfaces radiated, and the thick walls began their slow work. By late evening, the interior felt steady, not overheated, not drafty, but balanced. When Elias banked his fire and lay down, he did not expect warmth to vanish with the coals. It didn't. While other cabins shed heat hour by hour, Elias's walls released it slowly, almost reluctantly. The stone-filled core absorbed the fire's energy and returned it back into the room long after the flames had died. At 3 in the morning, when others rose to feed their stoves, Elias slept on. At dawn, when men cursed frozen water and numb fingers, Elias's cabin remained above freezing, its air still holding the memory of last night's fire. The valley began to notice. Men spoke quietly of temperature differences, of cabins that stayed warmer longer, of nights that passed without interruption. Some dismissed it as luck. Others blamed hidden fuel use. A few simply refused to believe it at all. But winter does not tolerate denial. As the cold deepened and the nights grew longer, the difference between cabins became impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like unnecessary labor was beginning to look like foresight. The real winter had arrived. And it was about to separate those who fought the cold every hour from the one man who had prepared for it in advance. The night that settled the argument did not arrive with drama. There was no storm, no wind, no warning. The cold simply deepened and stayed there. By dusk, the valley was already locked below 40 degrees under zero. Smoke rose straight from chimneys, climbing into the black sky like thin pillars, unmoving in the frozen air. Men moved carefully, conserving strength, knowing what the night would demand of them. That evening, the cabins were prepared in the same way they always were. Stoves were loaded heavy with split spruce. Dampers were opened wide. Iron glowed. Supper was cooked, boots were dried, and for a brief time, every shelter in the valley felt warm enough. Elias Rook did nothing unusual. He burned no extra wood. He added no secret fuel. He followed the same routine he had followed since the cold settled in. Across the valley, in cabins built to the standard design, men did the same. By 9 o'clock, most stoves were banked for the night. The fires were allowed to burn down naturally, their energy already spent or in the process of escaping into the darkness beyond the walls. At first, the differences were subtle. By 10, One could feel the air beginning to cool in the single-wall cabins. Not cold yet, just thinner, less forgiving. Walls that had felt solid at supper began to lose their warmth. The floor stiffened beneath bare boots. In Elias's cabin, nothing changed. The temperature held steady, as if the fire were still burning. The inner walls remained warm to the touch. The air did not rush toward the corners or sink toward the floor. It simply lingered. Midnight passed. In other cabins, men shifted under their blankets. Breath thickened. Some stirred but did not yet rise. They waited, hoping the fire would hold a little longer. At 1 a.m, the difference became undeniable. In the standard cabins, water buckets began to film with ice. Frost crept along the lower logs. A few men woke fully now, cursed softly, and pulled on coats to tend the stove. The night was breaking them into smaller pieces. In Elias Rook's cabin, the air remained calm. The stone-filled walls continued to release their stored heat, hour by hour, smoothing what would have been a steep and dangerous drop. Elias slept through it. At 3 a.m, when most of the valley was awake, Elias's cabin still held its warmth. The fire had been out for hours, yet the room had not surrendered. No ice formed. No drafts cut across the floor. The walls themselves were doing the work the stove no longer could. By dawn, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Men stepped out of their cabins hollow-eyed, exhausted from broken sleep. Inside their shelters, temperatures had fallen near freezing. Fires were rebuilt from cold ash. Coffee was coaxed back to life with numb fingers. Elias opened his door and stepped into the same cold, rested. Inside his cabin, the air still held warmth. Not comfort, not luxury, but safety. Enough heat to dress without gloves. Enough to boil water without desperation. Enough to prove that something fundamental had shifted. That morning, men began to talk openly. They compared notes. They compared nights. They compared exhaustion. The question was no longer whether Elias Rook's cabin was different. The question was why. Because on a night when every stove burned the same wood, and every man did the same work, one cabin had held on to its heat while the rest had let it slip away into the dark. Winter had delivered its verdict, and the valley was finally ready to listen. What Elias Rook understood was not magic. It was not luck, and it was not strength. It was physics, simple, unforgiving, and the same in every century. Most men believed heat was something you made. You chopped wood, fed the stove, and produced warmth. When the fire went out, the heat disappeared. To survive, you repeated the process, again and again, through the night. Elias believed something different. He believed heat was something you could store. The single-wall cabins scattered across the valley were built almost entirely of wood. Wood warms quickly, but it also cools quickly. Once the fire slowed, the thin walls had nothing left to give. They absorbed heat for a short time, then surrendered it just as fast to the frozen air outside. These cabins acted like tin cups placed near a flame. They heated fast, and they cooled fast. Elias's cabin behaved more like a brick oven. The stones packed between his inner and outer walls created what engineers now call thermal mass, material dense enough to absorb large amounts of heat and release it slowly over time. Stone does not warm quickly, but once it does, it resists cooling. During the evening firing, when the stove burned hot, excess heat that would normally rush out through the walls was instead captured by the stone core. Each rock absorbed energy quietly, without raising the air temperature too high. The cabin did not overheat, it charged. Then, when the fire died, the process reversed. As the air began to cool, the stone released its stored heat back into the room. Not all at once, but gradually, hour by hour, slowing the temperature drop and preventing the sharp swings that made other cabins dangerous by morning. The 12-inch gap between the walls mattered just as much. That space trapped still air, reducing direct heat loss. More importantly, it separated the inner living space from the outer shell exposed to the cold. The outer wall could freeze without stealing warmth directly from the room. The inner wall stayed warmer, fed by the stone behind it. Heat loss was no longer immediate. It became delayed. In practical terms, this changed everything. A standard cabin lost heat so quickly that interior temperatures tracked the fire's decline almost minute by minute. When the flames faded, the cabin followed. Elias's cabin lost heat slowly enough that the night passed before the warmth did. This is why Elias did not need to burn more wood. He burned smarter. Instead of feeding a weak fire all night, he fired hard for a short period. allowing the stone to absorb maximum energy. Once charged, the walls worked on his behalf while he slept. The stove was no longer the only source of heat. The cabin itself became one. Most frontier builders had never thought this way because their experience taught them to fight cold with effort, not understanding. They measured warmth in flames and labor, not in time and mass. Elias measured differently. He measured how long heat stayed when the fire was gone. That single shift in thinking, treating heat as something to be stored rather than constantly replaced, was the difference between waking every 2 hours and sleeping through the night. The science had always been there. The winter simply forced it into view. Belief is easy to dismiss. Numbers are not. As winter deepened, talk around the valley changed. At first, men spoke in vague terms, warmer, steadier, not waking as much. But before long, curiosity demanded proof. So they began to measure. Thermometers were rare, but a few men owned alcohol gauges nailed to cabin walls, placed at bunk height where cold was felt most. Others relied on simpler markers. Whether water froze overnight, how long it took to relight a stove, how many hours of sleep passed without interruption. The patterns were unmistakable. In the single-wall cabins, temperature dropped fast once the fire burned down. A warm 60 degrees at bedtime slid into the 40s by midnight, then hovered near freezing by dawn. Water skimmed with ice. Boots stiffened. Hands went numb before morning coffee was ready. In Elias Rook's cabin, the decline was slower and smaller. On nights when the outside air held steady below 40 under zero, his interior temperature remained well above freezing even after the fire had been out for hours. The walls stayed warm to the touch. No ice formed in the corners. Sleep came in long, uninterrupted stretches. Men compared notes quietly at first, then openly. They noticed something else as well, something that challenged long-held assumptions. Elias was not burning more wood. In fact, he was burning less. While others fed their stoves through the night, Elias loaded his once burned hot, and let the cabin do the rest. His woodpile shrank more slowly. His axe stayed leaned against the wall, while others were forced out into the cold to cut more fuel. Effort had not disappeared. It had been shifted. The proof became impossible to ignore during the worst stretch of the season. For several nights in a row, the valley never climbed above extreme cold. Not at dawn. Not at dusk. Fires were allowed to burn out in every cabin at roughly the same time. The results spoke clearly. Single-wall cabins lost heat at a steady, punishing rate. Elias's cabin lost it reluctantly, as if the walls themselves resisted surrender. Men who had mocked his extra work now stood inside his doorway, feeling the difference with their hands rather than their opinions. Some stayed longer than they meant to. A few stayed the night. No argument survived that experience. There was no trick, no hidden fuel, no exaggeration, just stone, mass, and time working together. By midwinter, the conversation had shifted again. No longer does it work, but can it be copied? Winter had reduced the debate to its essentials. The data was clear, the comfort was real, and the old assumptions were failing under the weight of evidence. Elias Rook had not won an argument. He had let winter do it for him. The moment that changed how the valley saw Elias Rook did not come from numbers. It came from failure. Late one night, during the coldest stretch of the season, a problem unfolded in a cabin downstream. It began quietly, an unfamiliar smell, a faint haze near the ceiling. A stovepipe joint, stressed by weeks of heating and cooling, had loosened just enough to leak smoke back into the room. The men inside noticed too late. They faced a choice no one should have to make at 40 below. Keep the fire burning and breathe smoke, or kill the fire and face the cold. They chose the cold. Within hours, the cabin temperature collapsed. Frost formed on the walls. Water froze solid. Fingers lost feeling. Sleep was impossible. By the time they reached Elias Rook's door, the night was already deep. Elias did not hesitate. He opened the door and waved them in. The contrast struck immediately. 6 men crowded into a space meant for one, their breath thick with moisture, their clothing stiff with frost. In any standard cabin, that much body heat and damp air would have turned the room into a steam box, followed by an ice cave once the fire died. But Elias's cabin absorbed it. The stone-filled walls drank in excess heat and moisture without complaint. The temperature held steady. No condensation froze on the logs. The air stayed clear enough to breathe. Men sat with their backs against the walls and felt warmth where none should have remained. They slept, truly slept, for the first time in days. By morning, the lesson was no longer theoretical. The cabin that had seemed wasteful and slow to build had become a refuge. Not because Elias intended it to be, but because it was built to endure imbalance. Heat, moisture, crowding, conditions that broke other shelters only strengthened his. Word spread quickly, not as rumor, but as fact. Men who had dismissed Elias's methods now spoke of them with respect. The language changed. No longer foolish. Now careful. No longer overbuilt. Now prepared. What mattered most was not comfort, but margin. Elias's cabin had margin. Margin between warm and cold. Between safe and dangerous. Between a bad night and a fatal one. In a winter where mistakes compounded quickly, that margin saved lives. No speeches were made. No credit claimed. Elias returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. But the valley had learned something it could not unlearn. A cabin could be more than shelter. It could be insurance against failure. And from that night on, when men talked about surviving the winter, they no longer spoke only of fire and effort. They spoke of walls, of weight, of building for the moment when things went wrong. They spoke quietly of Elias Rook. Ideas move slowly in places where survival leaves little room for experimentation. But once an idea proves itself through winter, it travels fast. After the night Elias Rook's cabin became a refuge, men began to ask questions, not out of curiosity, but necessity. They wanted to know measurements, spacing, materials, how much stone, where to place the stove, how long to fire it before sleeping. Elias answered plainly. He did not argue. He did not preach. He described what he had built and why it worked, leaving the conclusions to the men who had already felt the difference in their bones. The first changes were small. A few cabins stacked stone along interior walls near the stove, creating crude heat sinks. Others built short crib walls filled with river rock to catch radiant heat. These makeshift additions did not transform their cabins, but they softened the worst temperature swings and bought precious hours of sleep. Then came the more serious builders. Men with enough strength and time began tearing into existing walls, adding inner shells where space allowed. New cabins went up with wider foundations, designed from the start to carry weight. Where stone was scarce, builders used brick, gravel, even packed earth, anything dense enough to hold heat and give it back slowly. The principle mattered more than the material. Store heat when it is abundant. Release it when it is not. Word carried beyond the valley. Crews along neighboring creeks heard about cabins that stayed warm without constant tending. Foremen responsible for bunkhouses, where 10 men sleeping meant moisture, instability, and danger, paid close attention. They could not afford structures that failed overnight. Scaled versions of Elias's idea began to appear. Central heat zones surrounded by stone. Thicker walls. Slower heat loss. Less fuel burned. Fewer men waking to stoke fires. Fewer accidents caused by exhaustion and cold. What surprised many was not that the method worked, but that it worked everywhere it was tried. Different layouts, different fuels, different builders. The same result. Once people understood that the stove was only half the system, everything changed. The building itself became part of the solution. By late winter, the valley looked different. Heavier, more deliberate. Cabins no longer stood like thin shells against the cold. They sat grounded, anchored by mass and intention. Elias Rook did not claim ownership of the idea. He did not need to. Winter had already endorsed it. And as the days slowly lengthened and the cold loosened its grip, one truth remained clear to everyone who had endured the season. The cabins that survived best were not the ones that burned the most wood. They were the ones that remembered the heat longest. Frontier people were not reckless. They were practical. They did not survive harsh land by ignoring reality, but by paying close attention to it. Every habit, every tool, every building method that endured did so because it solved a real problem, often at great personal cost before the lesson was learned. What the valley had mistaken for foolishness in Elias Rook was something far older and far rarer. Patience. Most men had been taught to fight winter with effort. Cut more wood. Burn hotter fires. Wake more often. Push harder. That mindset worked in mild cold, where exhaustion came slowly and mistakes could be corrected. But in extreme cold, effort alone became a liability. Frontier winters did not reward strength. They punished it. Men who relied on constant labor burned themselves down as surely as they burned their woodpiles. Sleep deprivation dulled judgment. Cold fingers made small errors dangerous. Fatigue turned routine tasks into risks. Elias had understood something different. He did not try to outwork the cold. He tried to outlast it. That distinction mattered. Instead of asking how hot his cabin could become, he asked how long it could remain warm after the fire went out. Instead of focusing on resistance, he focused on cooperation, using materials that worked with the laws of heat rather than against them. Stone did not rush. Neither did winter. By matching the slow release of stored heat to the long, silent hours of darkness, Elias aligned his shelter with the rhythm of the land itself. His cabin did not fight the night. It endured it. This way of thinking was not new. It had existed long before iron stoves and frontier cabins. It lived in old masonry structures, in earth-walled homes, in places where people understood that survival depended on shaping time as much as space. But such knowledge was easy to forget when speed became the priority. On the frontier, forgetting was costly. What the valley learned that winter was not merely a better way to build a cabin. It was a better way to think about survival. One that valued foresight over force, understanding over urgency, preparation over reaction. The men who changed their cabins changed something else as well, their relationship with winter. They slept more. They worked better. They survived with less strain. And they carried that lesson forward. Because frontier wisdom was never about doing more. It was about doing what mattered, long after the fire had gone out. When spring finally returned to the valley, it did so quietly. The cold loosened its grip a little at a time. Ice pulled back from the riverbanks. Snow softened underfoot. Smoke from chimneys no longer carried the same urgency it once had. Men slept longer. Woodpiles stopped shrinking so fast. But something else remained. The winter had left behind more than scars and stories. It had left behind understanding. What Elias Rook built was not simply a warmer cabin. It was a different relationship with cold, one rooted in patience rather than struggle. Long after the deepest freezes had passed, men still spoke about the walls that stayed warm when the fire was gone, and the nights that no longer demanded constant attention. That idea did not vanish with the snow. It followed the men wherever they went next. In other valleys, in other winters, the same principles appeared again. Thicker walls, heavier materials, buildings designed to hold heat rather than chase it. Different names were used, different tools, but the thinking was the same. Store warmth when you have it. Release it slowly when you need it most. Modern builders would later give this approach technical names. Passive design, thermal mass, heat retention. Engineers would measure it with equations and diagrams. But the truth had already been proven by men who learned it the hard way, without books or laboratories. They learned it by waking up cold. They learned it by watching fires die too soon. And they learned it by noticing the one man who slept through the night while others fed the flames. Elias Rook never set out to teach anyone. He did not leave behind blueprints or instructions carved into stone. What he left behind was quieter than that, a reminder that survival is rarely about doing more. It is about understanding what lasts. Frontier life rewarded those who could see beyond the immediate moment. Those who built not just for the evening, but for the long hours that followed. Those who respected the land enough to work with its rules instead of exhausting themselves fighting them. The winter that tested the valley eventually passed. The lesson did not. And it still matters, because cold has not changed. Physics has not changed. And the value of forgotten wisdom has not changed either. Some nights, survival is not decided by how hot the fire burns, but by how long the warmth remains after it goes out. If you value stories like this, stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, consider staying with us. And if you're watching from a place where winter still teaches hard lessons, we'd like to know. Because these stories were never meant to be forgotten.